The sting of betrayal is sharpest when it comes from the people you love most. "You don't deserve this house anymore. Hand over the keys." Those words, hurled at a father by his own family, weren't just cruel. They were a fracture that would never fully heal. One slap, one moment of humiliation, and the illusion of love collapsed into cold greed. From that instant, what was once quiet sacrifice turned into a battle for dignity, truth, and survival. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Thomas Reed, and at 69 years old, I often find myself waking before dawn, the silence of my craftsman house filling the air with a kind of heavy stillness. I built much of this house with my own hands, sanding the hardwood floors beside my late wife Linda, restoring the porch railings, and planting the rose bushes that still bloom in the spring. It sits on a quiet street in Portland's Alameda neighborhood, where maples line the sidewalks and neighbors wave as they walk their dogs. To most, my home is simply another relic from an older generation, but to me, it is a living archive of a life Linda and I built together. I live simply now. My clothes are plain, usually from the local outlet store. My truck is more than 10 years old. Its paint dulled by the rain, but its engine still steady. Every morning, I check the tomato vines in the backyard, trimming the yellowing leaves, humming songs I remember from the shipyard where I spent decades as a marine engineer. Simplicity suits me. It keeps me steady. Yet people rarely understand that simplicity is not weakness. It is a choice. For much of my life, I worked at the docks, troubleshooting engines, and overseeing cargo vessels that came and went along the West Coast. The job demanded precision, discipline, and long hours, but it also gave me a sense of responsibility that carried into every corner of my life. I retired officially years ago, though I still take consulting jobs when the younger engineers run into problems they can't untangle. The money I earned and invested wisely, along with a modest office building I bought decades ago, provides more than enough to live comfortably. Outsiders assume I scrape by on a pension, but appearances can be deceiving. Linda understood that better than anyone. She believed wealth was something to protect, not flaunt. "Invisible wealth keeps you safe," she would say. "Visible wealth just paints a target." She passed away 7 years ago after a long battle with cancer, and since then the house has been quieter, heavier, yet still filled with her presence. The worn quilt on the couch, the photographs lining the hallway, even the way the floorboards creak in the kitchen, all reminders of her. I've kept the house not only because it holds our memories, but because letting go would feel like betraying the promise we made to each other, to guard what we had built, both tangible and unseen. My son Daniel, now 35, grew up running through these very rooms. As a boy, he had a gentle streak, always asking if I needed help, always quick to hug his mother. But adulthood has carved him into someone harder, less patient. His job as a sales manager barely covers his expenses, and his desire to keep up appearances has left him juggling credit card debts and car payments. I've helped him more times than he knows, covering a hospital bill here, paying for a car repair there, quietly transferring money for his wedding deposits. I kept records of every dollar, not because I planned to collect them, but because order has always been my shield against chaos. Then there is Sloane, my daughter-in-law. She is 29, sharp-tongued, with the polished look of someone who invests in appearances, designer handbags, manicured nails, a practiced smile. From the beginning, she looked at my life with thinly veiled disdain. She once asked if my truck even passed emissions testing, and another time commented that I should upgrade my wardrobe now that I was about to be a grandfather. I laughed it off, though her words left small cuts. Every time she visited, her eyes roamed my house as though she were a realtor sizing up square footage. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew the truth. She saw opportunity where I saw memory. In Alameda, the neighborhood has been shifting. Families with new money have bought up old homes, repainting them in trendy colors, parking electric cars in the driveways. Some of my neighbors have downsized, moving into condos closer to downtown. More than once I've heard the suggestion, maybe you'd be more comfortable in a retirement community. They mean well, but their words carry an undertone that says, you're taking up space meant for others. I've resisted. This is not just a house, it's my anchor. The contrast between me and the younger families is stark. While they install rooftop solar panels and talk about investment portfolios at block parties, I sip coffee on the porch and mend garden tools. I don't mind the difference. What I do mind is the growing sense that even my own family sees my simplicity as a liability. Daniel visits less often now, and when he does, he seems rushed, distracted, tethered to his phone. Sloane accompanies him, but her presence feels like a silent audit. I've noticed the way she opens cupboards or glances down the hallway. I play along, pretending not to notice, but the unease gnaws at me. My son doesn't defend me when she makes sly remarks, and sometimes I catch him echoing her tone, as if he's rehearsing lines from her script. I keep telling myself that families go through seasons, that Daniel is under stress, that Sloane's barbs come from insecurity rather than malice. I want to believe kindness will prevail, that the small humiliations I endure are temporary, but a whisper in the back of my mind warns me otherwise. One evening, as the Portland sky turned copper and the neighborhood settled into quiet, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea. The roses Linda planted brushed against the railing, releasing their faint perfume. I imagined her voice, reminding me that strength is not loud, that dignity does not need applause. Yet as the shadows lengthened, I couldn't shake the feeling that the very simplicity we had chosen to protect us was now being mistaken for weakness. If you're still watching and feeling the sting of that betrayal, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Now, let's uncover how the cracks in this family began to show. The smell of rosemary chicken filled my kitchen that Saturday evening, a recipe Linda had perfected years ago and one I still made when Daniel came to visit. I had set the table with the old stoneware plates we bought on our honeymoon, their edges chipped from decades of use but still sturdy, still good enough for a family meal. I told myself this dinner would be a chance to reconnect, to remind my son of simpler times. Yet from the moment Daniel and Sloane walked through the door, I sensed the undertow of tension that lingered beneath their smiles. Sloane's eyes darted around the living room, lingering on the worn armchair by the fireplace, the faded rug, the old clock on the mantel. "It's cozy," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Daniel gave a small laugh, as if to soften her remark, but I noticed he didn't contradict her. My grip on the serving spoon tightened. I had invited them to share a meal, not to pass judgment on my life. Dinner began with the usual pleasantries, work updates, traffic complaints, the cost of groceries. I listened, nodding where appropriate, though my mind drifted to Linda's absence. She had been the glue, the one who could disarm Daniel with a smile and remind him of his better self. Without her, the silences grew longer, filled only by Sloane's assessments. Halfway through the meal, Sloane placed her fork down delicately and leaned forward, her eyes fixed on me with feigned sincerity. "Thomas, have you ever considered selling this place?" she asked. "There are beautiful retirement communities outside Portland, low maintenance, medical staff on hand, social activities. It would be so much safer for you." Her tone was sweet, but the suggestion landed like a blade. I set down my glass of water and looked across the table. Daniel shifted in his chair, avoiding my gaze. "She has a point, Dad," he murmured. "A big house like this. It's a lot for one person to handle. You should think about your health, about the future." I wanted to laugh, to remind them that I had fixed engines larger than this house, that I climbed ladders and endured storms when Daniel was still in diapers. But I kept silent, studying their expressions. Sloane's smile was too polished, her words rehearsed. Daniel's eyes betrayed unease, but he stayed in step with her. This was no casual conversation. It was a script. Then she reached into her handbag and unfolded a glossy brochure. "Look," she said, sliding it across the table. "Riverside Haven, spacious apartments, community gardens, a pool. They even offer shuttle service to downtown. The images gleamed with sterile perfection: wide hallways, cheerful staff in uniforms, elderly residents smiling like actors. I stared at the paper without touching it. They had come prepared, as though tonight's dinner had been planned for this very performance. When I excused myself to fetch dessert, I paused by the kitchen door. Voices drifted through, hushed but clear enough. Sloane's voice carried a sharp edge. "The location is prime, Mom. Once he moves out, it's practically ours. Just be patient." My heart pounded in my ears. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. She wasn't speaking to me at all. She was updating her own mother. The words echoed through me like a hammer strike. My house, the home Linda and I had built with care, was nothing more than a prize in Sloane's mind. I steadied myself against the counter, willing my hands to stop trembling before I carried the pie to the table. Back in the dining room, I forced a calm smile, though the world felt tilted. Sloane chattered about new restaurants downtown. Daniel nodded absently, and I sat in silence, tasting betrayal with every bite. When the evening wound down, Sloane rose gracefully, smoothing her dress. As she slipped into her coat, she turned back to me with a glint in her eye. "You'll see, Thomas," she said softly. "Big houses are wasted on old men." The sweetness of her smile only sharpened the cruelty of her words. Daniel stood by the door, his hand fumbling with his car keys. "Think about it, Dad," he said finally, his voice flat, resigned. He didn't defend me, didn't correct her. He simply let the weight of her insult hang in the air before they stepped out into the cool Portland night. After the door shut, silence engulfed the house. I sat in my armchair, staring at the brochure still lying on the table. My hand rested on the folder of financial papers I kept in the drawer beside me, documents Linda and I had guarded for decades. They had never known the truth, had never guessed at what I possessed beyond this modest life. The clock ticked steadily on the mantel, marking the minutes as the realization settled in. What I had dismissed as casual remarks were not casual at all. They were the opening moves of something calculated, something ruthless. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It had already arrived, disguised as a family dinner. If you're still watching and want to see how the first signs of manipulation grew stronger, comment number 2 below. Now, let's move into the moment where the real conflict begins. The invitation had come weeks earlier, a glossy card embossed with silver lettering, announcing the annual gala for Daniel's company. At first, I considered declining. Crowds and small talk were never my strong suit. But Daniel had insisted. "Come on, Dad," he'd said over the phone. "It'll look good if family is there. You can meet my boss." His words carried less warmth than expectation, but I agreed, thinking perhaps it was a chance to bridge the distance that had been growing between us. That evening, Portland's skyline glimmered with the kind of crisp clarity only autumn brings. I arrived at the Hilton downtown, dressed in my best suit, one Linda had helped me choose years ago for a wedding we'd attended together. It was dated, I knew, but pressed and clean. In the lobby, men wore tailored tuxedos, women glittered in gowns, and I felt suddenly aware of the scuffed soles of my shoes. Still, I held my head high. Inside the ballroom, chandeliers blazed over white linen tables, and a jazz trio played softly near the stage. Daniel was already surrounded by colleagues, his laughter pitched higher than usual, the sound of a man trying to impress. Sloane stood at his side, snapping photos for social media, tilting her head to catch the light just right. When she spotted me, her smile flickered only briefly before she returned to her phone. I found my seat at a corner table, away from the main bustle, and watched. The food was extravagant, tiny portions arranged like artwork on porcelain plates. I ate slowly, grateful for the distraction. Now and then, someone would pass by, glance at me with polite curiosity, then move on. I was invisible in a room that prided itself on appearances. Halfway through dinner, a man with slicked hair and a gold tie leaned toward me. "So, you're Daniel's father? I heard you've got quite a big place up in Alameda. Must be hard keeping up with all that space." His tone was conversational, but there was a probing glint in his eye. Before I could answer, Sloane's voice cut in. "Yes, but not for long," she said brightly, balancing her champagne flute as if it were part of the performance. "We're making sure he moves somewhere safer, somewhere more appropriate. A few people chuckled politely, as though it were a light-hearted joke, and the man with the gold tie nodded, satisfied. The laughter stung worse than any insult. I forced a small smile, though my chest tightened. I wanted to ask Daniel to step in, to remind his wife that dignity isn't something to toy with. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably and looked at the floor. Moments later, Sloane leaned closer to the group, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. "Sometimes he forgets things, you know," she said with a mock whisper. "It's really time he passes down the keys before he loses them altogether." Then she extended her hand toward me, palm up, as if she truly expected me to drop my house keys there, in front of everyone. I stared at her hand, my mind blank with disbelief. "No," I said simply, my voice low but steady. The word hung in the air, sharp against the murmurs of the crowd. Sloane's face flushed red. She forced a laugh, but her eyes flashed with anger. "Don't be difficult, Thomas," she snapped, her tone losing its polished veneer. "You know it's the right thing." When I didn't move, something in her broke. With a sudden, reckless motion, she raised her hand and struck my face. The slap cracked through the ballroom, silencing the music, silencing the chatter. My glasses flew from my nose, clattering to the marble floor. Heat bloomed across my cheek, but the greater wound was inside, where humiliation cut deep. The room froze. Dozens of faces turned toward us. Some looked away quickly. Others whispered, but no one stepped forward. Daniel stood only a few feet away, his jaw clenched, his cheeks burning crimson. Yet he didn't move. He didn't say a word. I bent slowly, retrieving my glasses with trembling hands. Through the blur of light and faces, I saw my son's eyes, filled not with shame for his wife's actions, but with a cowardly avoidance that told me everything. In that instant, I understood I was utterly alone. The sting on my cheek faded into something colder, heavier. Linda's voice came back to me, as clearly as if she were beside me. "Dignity is the one thing you should never surrender." I had endured years of slights, tolerated whispers, ignored the glances of disdain. But this was different. This was a line crossed in front of strangers, my worth reduced to a spectacle. I rose, straightening my suit jacket, and without another word, walked out. The air outside was sharp with October chill, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement. Each breath felt like fire in my lungs, but I welcomed it. Pain was clarity. Pain was resolve. In my pocket, my fingers brushed against a fountain pen Linda had given me decades ago, engraved with my initials. I gripped it tightly, as though it could tether me to the man I used to be. I whispered into the night, barely audible even to myself. "It ends tonight." I didn't look back at the hotel. Behind me, the music would resume, the guests would return to their drinks, and my son would continue pretending not to see. But I knew something had shifted inside me, something irreversible. I had been humiliated in front of a crowd, betrayed by silence as much as by violence, and I had no intention of letting it stand. If you're still watching and can sense the storm building, drop a number 3 in the comments. Now, let's step into the turning point where everything starts to unravel. The morning after the gala, I woke with the sting of humiliation still raw on my face. Though the swelling had gone down, the echo of Sloane's hand against my cheek burned deeper than the skin. It wasn't the pain that lingered, but the silence of my son, the stillness with which he had allowed me to be struck like a stranger. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling between my hands, watching the steam curl upward, trying to think of what to do next. For years, I had kept my peace, hoping Daniel would come around on his own. Now, I knew I couldn't afford more silence. I dialed his number before I could talk myself out of it. The line rang longer than usual. At last, his tired voice answered. "Dad?" "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady though my heart pounded. "Just you and me. Not at the house, not with her there." There was hesitation on the other end. A car horn blared faintly in the background, and I imagined him sitting in traffic, gripping the steering wheel. "Fine," he muttered. "Tomorrow. Cafe Monroe at noon." Then the line went dead. The next day, I drove into downtown Portland and parked near the cafe. The place was bustling with the lunch crowd, the air thick with the scent of espresso and pastries. I spotted Daniel at a corner table, hunched over his phone, dark circles under his eyes. He looked older than his 35 years, worn thin by debt and worry, though he tried to mask it with the crisp lines of a work shirt that hadn't been ironed properly. I slid into the seat across from him. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the clatter of cups and hum of conversation filling the gap between us. Finally, I spoke. "Daniel, about last night. What happened? It wasn't just embarrassing. It was wrong. Your wife humiliated me in front of strangers, and you stood there." His thumb tapped absently against his phone screen, though he didn't raise his eyes. I pressed on. "Son, this isn't about the house. It's about respect. Your mother would never have believed we'd come to this. She raised you better." For a moment, I thought I saw his jaw tighten, a flicker of the boy I remembered who once defended kids smaller than him on the playground. But then he exhaled and leaned back. "Dad, Sloane's right. You can't keep rattling around that big old place alone. It's not practical. You're almost 70. Things could go wrong and no one would know." The words cut deeper than he realized. They weren't his words, they were hers. I could hear Sloane's sharp tone echoing in his voice, her influence heavy in every syllable. I shook my head slowly. "Do you even hear yourself? You sound like you've rehearsed this." He shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting away. And then, almost by accident, he let it slip. "We already talked to someone about the process. Just to see what it would take, a lawyer, about transferring the property if you agreed." The world seemed to tilt. My coffee sat untouched, the dark surface trembling with my unsteady breath. They hadn't just thought about it, they had acted, gone to a lawyer, discussed paperwork as if my home, my life, my memories were items on a grocery list. I stared at my son, searching his face for the boy who once built model ships with me at this very table, who once said he wanted to be just like Dad. All I saw was a man too tired, too tangled in debts and desperation to stand on his own. "Daniel," I said quietly, the weight of my words pressing down. "Do you understand what you're doing? You're letting her convince you that selling out your own father is the solution." His lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not like that," he said, though the weakness in his voice betrayed him. "We're just trying to do what's best." "What's best for who?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he gathered his things, slipping his phone into his pocket. "I have to get back to work," he muttered, rising from the table without looking me in the eye. I watched him leave, the door swinging shut behind him. Around me, the cafe buzzed with laughter and clinking cups, but I felt utterly alone. My coffee had gone cold, the surface reflecting my own weary face. My first attempt had failed. I had reached for my son, and he had chosen her. I sat there a long while, hands folded over the table, feeling the weight of Linda's absence more than ever. She would have known what to say, how to pierce through his armor of excuses. All I had was silence, and the knowledge that words would never be enough to turn him back. As I finally stood to leave, I realized something with startling clarity. If I wanted to protect what Linda and I had built, I could no longer rely on appeals to love or reason. The battle ahead would not be won with quiet conversations in coffee shops. It would demand something far stronger. If you're still watching and want to know why the first attempt to fix things only made it worse, type number 4 below. Now, let's dive deeper into the struggle that pushed tensions even higher. The invitation arrived in a cream-colored envelope, sealed with gold embossing. Daniel's handwriting scrawled across the front. "Dad, we hope you'll come." For days, I debated tearing it up and pretending it had never reached my hands. But no matter how angry I felt, this was my son's wedding. A part of me clung to the faint hope that, surrounded by vows and promises, he might remember what it meant to stand for family. The hotel was a palace of glass and marble in downtown Portland, glowing like a lantern against the October sky. Inside, the ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and polished silver. 100 guests buzzed with excitement, their voices weaving together in a fabric of chatter and laughter. I entered quietly, dressed in the same navy suit I had worn to Linda's funeral. It was plain compared to the tuxedos and sequins around me, but it felt like armor. Sloane spotted me first. She glided across the room, her gown trailing like a declaration of wealth. "Thomas," she said brightly, her lips stretching into a smile that never reached her eyes. "So glad you could make it." Her fingers brushed my sleeve, but her eyes told me I was an intruder. I nodded stiffly, finding a seat at the edge of the room where I could watch without being watched. The ceremony itself was brief, a flurry of vows and applause. What followed was a celebration drenched in extravagance. Champagne towers, a live band, courses of food plated like art. I sat mostly in silence, enduring the sideways glances and whispers. "He looks so fragile," someone muttered near me. "That house is too much for him." I clenched my jaw, staring at the tablecloth, pretending not to hear. As the evening wore on, the master of ceremonies took the microphone. He congratulated the couple, spoke of bright futures, and then, with a grin, added, "And what a blessing to have such a wonderful family home to start their life together." An applause filled the hall, and in the sudden roar, my stomach dropped. Sloane rose gracefully, her glass in hand, her face radiant under the lights. She turned, scanning the crowd until her gaze locked on me. "Thomas," she called, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "it's time to hand over the keys." The room fell into a hush. Heads turned toward me, eyes wide with anticipation, as though I were part of the entertainment. My pulse pounded in my ears. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said, my voice steady but quiet. Her smile cracked. "Don't be stubborn," she pressed. "You've had your time. Now it's ours." She extended her hand across the floor, palm open, like a queen expecting tribute. Laughter rippled nervously through the crowd. When I didn't move, her face twisted. In one swift, furious motion, she closed the distance between us and struck me across the cheek. The sound rang like a gunshot. My glasses flew from my face, clattering onto the marble floor. The sting burned hot, but what seared deeper was the collective gasp of 100 witnesses. The music stopped. The chatter died. For a moment, all I could hear was the rush of blood in my head. Guests stared in stunned silence. A few pulled out their phones, recording. My son stood nearby, his face pale, his hands trembling. But he said nothing, not a word. I bent slowly, my hand shaking as I retrieved my glasses. The room wavered through the cracked lens, a blur of shocked expressions and whispered disbelief. I searched Daniel's face for some sign of defiance, some shred of the boy who once swore he'd always protect me. Instead, I saw only shame and silence. Before I could speak, Sloane turned to the crowd with triumph in her eyes. "We've already prepared the paperwork," she declared. "Our family attorney can confirm." From the back of the hall, a man in a suit rose, clutching a folder. He cleared his throat and announced that a draft agreement had been drawn, ready to sign. Gasps echoed through the room. I felt the ground tilt beneath me. This was no impulsive act, no moment of heated cruelty. It was a plan, crafted, rehearsed, executed with precision. They had conspired not just to shame me, but to erase me. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. My cheek throbbed, my pride burned, and yet somewhere inside me, a strange calm settled. Linda's voice returned to me as clearly as ever. "Dignity is the one thing you should never surrender." I straightened, placing my glasses back on my face despite the crack across one lens. For a few seconds, I looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of strangers who didn't know me, but who had just witnessed everything. Then, without a word, I turned and walked toward the exit. The doors opened onto the cold Portland night. The air rushed against my face, sharp and cleansing. Behind me, murmurs rose, the music faltered, chaos rippled through the ballroom. But I didn't look back. Not once. On the sidewalk, I paused, my breath forming clouds in the chill. My hand brushed the fountain pen in my pocket, its weight familiar, comforting. I clenched it tight, whispering to myself, "It ends tonight." The storm had broken, and there would be no going back. I didn't sleep the night of the wedding. The humiliation clung to me like smoke, seeping into every corner of the house. I sat in the living room with the lights dimmed, the clock ticking loud against the silence, staring at the framed photographs on the mantel. Linda's smile glowed from a picture taken on our front porch years ago. Daniel stood between us, no more than 10 at the time, his grin wide, his arms wrapped around our waists. That boy, the one in the picture, would never have stood silent while his father was struck in front of 100 people. I traced the edge of the photo frame with trembling fingers, wondering when exactly I had lost him. Was it the moment Linda passed, leaving only me to steady him? Or was it gradual, a slow drift into the arms of someone who whispered promises of an easier life? My heart ached, but the ache was quickly giving way to something sharper, a recognition that this, finally, was the line I could not allow them to cross. The temptation to surrender whispered to me in the small hours. Sell the house, move to a modest apartment, avoid the battles and the gossip. At nearly 70, wouldn't it be easier to live quietly and let the younger generation take what they craved? The idea tempted me the way a warm bed tempts an exhausted man. But then Linda's voice returned, firm and unwavering, echoing from the past. Dignity is the one thing you should never surrender. The house around me wasn't just wood and stone. It was decades of sweat, laughter, and grief. Linda had picked out every detail, from the color of the shutters to the roses that climbed the garden fence. It was where she had held me after Daniel's birth, where she had whispered her last words, with her hand in mine. To give it away under pressure, to let it be stolen through manipulation, would mean betraying both her memory and myself. My eyes fell on the stack of unopened envelopes on my desk. Bills, bank statements, financial paperwork I had carefully managed but rarely discussed. A sudden impulse drove me to sort through them. As I flipped pages, I came across familiar entries. Transfers I had made to cover Daniel's credit card balances, quiet payments to his landlord, even a few wire receipts marked wedding expenses. He had thought these windfalls were company bonuses or fortunate breaks. In truth, they were me. Me trying to shield him, me trying to give him room to grow without watching him drown. The realization shook me. For years, I had been the invisible scaffold propping up his life, all while he and his wife plotted to strip me of my own. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, my generosity for obligation. But now, with every receipt and statement spread across the desk, I saw them for what they truly were: evidence, proof that I had not been a burden, but the very backbone of the life they flaunted. I leaned back in my chair, exhaustion mixing with clarity. If I stayed silent, they would spin the story however they pleased. They would cast me as senile, incapable, selfish. But if I spoke, if I revealed the truth, they would have no refuge in their lies. The choice was mine, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt the weight of control in my own hands. I reached for my phone and scrolled through the numbers until I found one I hadn't dialed in far too long. Michael Carter, an old friend of the family, now a respected lawyer in the city. He had stood beside me at Linda's funeral, promising that if I ever needed anything, I only had to ask. Tonight, I would ask. The phone rang twice before his familiar baritone answered. "Thomas? It's been a while?" I hesitated, the words heavy on my tongue. Then I spoke, steady and deliberate. "Michael, I need your help. Tomorrow morning, can we meet? It's about Daniel and Sloan and my house." There was a pause, the kind that tells you someone already senses the storm behind your words. "Of course," he said. "Come by my office. We'll talk through everything." When the call ended, I felt a shift inside me. The despair of the night cracked open just enough to let a sliver of resolve in. I gathered the bank statements into a folder, stacking them neatly, then wrote one sentence in my leather-bound journal, pressing the pen so hard it nearly tore the page. Tomorrow, I stopped being silent. I closed the book and set it on the desk. The house around me creaked softly, the kind of sound Linda used to say was the old beams settling in for the night. I let the silence wrap around me, not as loneliness this time, but as witness. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting, I was preparing. I turned off the lamp, climbed the stairs, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My cheeks still throbbed faintly from Sloane's hand, But in my chest, something new had taken root. Not anger alone, not grief, but a clear and unshakable decision. Whatever happened next, I would meet it head on. Tomorrow, the battle would begin. If you're still watching and can feel the weight of the decision ahead, comment number 5 below. Now, let's face the choice that will define everything. The morning light crept through the blinds, but I hadn't slept more than a couple of hours. My cheeks still bore the faint imprint of Sloane's hand, but it wasn't the sting that woke me, it was the vibration of my phone on the nightstand. When I picked it up, I was greeted by a flood of notifications, missed calls, text messages, and links to a video that had already gone viral. I clicked one of the links, and there it was. Grainy footage from someone's phone at the wedding. It captured everything: the toast, Sloane's demand for the keys, my refusal, and then the slap heard around the ballroom. The crowd's shocked gasp rippled through the speakers. In less than 12 hours, the video had already been shared thousands of times, comments pouring in faster than I could read them. Some comments made my stomach twist. That poor man. How could a bride do that on her own wedding night? Where was her husband? Others stung even deeper. The son's silence is the real betrayal. Daniel called within the hour. His voice was sharp, clipped. "Dad, you need to tell people this was a misunderstanding. Do you hear me? The video is everywhere. My coworkers are already whispering." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tight. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Daniel. It was the truth laid bare." "You're making it worse," he hissed. "Sloane's family is furious. Do you want to destroy my marriage, my reputation?" "Your wife destroyed her own reputation the moment she put her hands on me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I will no longer cover your lies." The silence on the other end was heavy, followed by the click of disconnection. For the first time in years, I had told him no, and meant it. By midday, the calls shifted from Daniel to Sloane. Her tone was different, pleading at first, then sharp with threats. "You're ruining us," she spat in one message. "Fix this, or we'll make sure you never live peacefully again." I let the phone ring, the words slide off me. Each attempt to twist the story only reminded me why I had chosen to fight. Meanwhile, Portland hummed with gossip. At the grocery store, I caught people whispering when I passed. At the coffee shop, 2 men at the counter muttered, "That's him, the old guy from the video." My name was in people's mouths, my dignity debated by strangers. But something unexpected happened too. Support. A neighbor I barely knew slipped a note under my door that read, "Stay strong. You don't deserve this." An old friend from church left a voicemail, offering to stand by me if things escalated. That afternoon, I walked into Michael Carter's law office with a folder tucked under my arm. His office smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the shelves lined with law books that seemed to stretch to the ceiling. Michael greeted me with the firm handshake of someone who had weathered many storms. "Thomas," he said, "tell me everything." I laid the receipts, bank statements, and transfer records across his desk, payment after payment, month after month, stretching back years. He thought they were bonuses, unexpected breaks. In reality, I've been covering his debts. Without me, he would have collapsed long ago. Michael adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents with a practiced eye. "This is more than proof of support, it's leverage. It shows you were never a burden, never incapable. Quite the opposite, you were the one propping him up." His words steadied me. For the first time in weeks, I felt the ground firm beneath my feet. "What do we do next?" I asked. "We'll begin with asset protection," he said. "You need to safeguard your house and your accounts. We'll also update your will and file precautionary motions to prevent any attempt to declare you incompetent, because—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've heard whispers." Sloane consulted with attorneys about guardianship cases. "They may be preparing to argue you can't handle your own affairs." The breath caught in my chest. It was worse than I imagined. Not only did they want the house, they wanted to strip me of my very autonomy. Michael leaned forward. "We can fight this, Thomas. But you must be ready. Once this begins, there's no going back." I nodded slowly. I've already gone too far to turn back. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat at my desk once more. My phone buzzed with another message, this time from Daniel. "Dad, if you go through with this, you won't have a son anymore." The words struck like a blade, clean and deep. For a long time, I stared at the screen, my heart pulling in two directions. He was my only child, the boy I had raised with love and sacrifice. But the man he had become was unrecognizable. I set the phone down, walked to the mantel, and looked at Linda's photograph again. Her eyes, warm and steady, seemed to hold mine. I whispered to her, my voice breaking yet resolute. "I'd rather lose a son than lose myself." The house was silent, but inside me something had shifted permanently. The path forward was painful, but it was mine. The days following my meeting with Michael passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and an odd mixture of dread and determination. I woke each morning earlier than usual, not out of restlessness, but out of purpose. For once, the heaviness in my chest was matched by a clear direction. If Daniel and Sloan thought I would retreat into silence, they were about to learn how mistaken they were. The first step was gathering every piece of evidence that could show the truth. I drove down to the bank where I had kept accounts for decades. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, guided me through the process of printing years of statements. The stack was thick, page after page revealing deposits, transfers, and payments that had quietly supported my son's lifestyle. Each sheet carried the weight of my sacrifice, but now it would serve as my shield. From there, I made a stop at the office of Daniel's former landlord. The man, grizzled and straightforward, didn't hesitate when I asked if he would provide documentation. "Sure, Mr. Whitaker," he said. "You covered his rent for months. If you hadn't, I would have had to evict them long ago." He scribbled out a statement, signed it, and pressed it into my hand. That piece of paper was more than proof. It was vindication. Back at Michael's office, I laid the growing pile of documents across his desk. He studied them with the sharp eye of someone who had spent his life in courtrooms. "This is strong," he said, tapping one of the pages. "We'll use it to establish a record that you were never dependent on your son. In fact, it was the other way around. That undermines any guardianship petition they might try to file." Then he leaned forward. "Thomas, I also recommend we update your will. Be explicit. Redirect assets to a senior protection fund or charitable trust. That way, if Daniel and Sloan expect to inherit, they'll know greed has consequences." I nodded slowly. The idea was painful, final almost, but necessary. "Do it," I told him. "I'd rather see my life's work help strangers than reward betrayal." Word of the wedding video continued to ripple through the community. At the grocery store, a clerk offered me a free cup of coffee and whispered, "Stay strong, sir." Everyone saw what she did. At church, members approached me after service, some sharing their own stories of children who had turned cold when money was involved. Their empathy warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. Then came an unexpected knock on my door. Mrs. Johnson, my elderly neighbor, who had lived down the block for 20 years, stood with a folder in her arms. "I thought you should see this," she said. Inside were photos and notes she had taken weeks earlier. One showed Sloan standing in my front yard with a man I didn't recognize, clipboard in hand, measuring tape dangling from his pocket. "They were snooping while you were out," she explained. I thought it odd at the time, but now it makes sense. My stomach twisted, but my resolve only hardened. They had been plotting to strip me of my home even before the wedding. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment cruelty, it was premeditated theft. That evening, Joseph stopped by. He carried a tray of sandwiches and the familiar warmth of his steady presence. "I'll be your witness," he said without hesitation. "I've seen the way they've treated you. I've heard their tone, their threats. You won't be standing alone in this." I felt a swell of gratitude that nearly brought me to tears. For so long, I had told myself I was fighting this battle in isolation. Now, between Michael's counsel, Mrs. Johnson's evidence, and Joseph's loyalty, I saw that I had allies. Even the strangers who sent letters of encouragement after watching the video felt like unexpected comrades. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my leather-bound notebook. The lamplight cast long shadows across the pages as I began writing down a plan. Finalize the new will with Michael. File legal protections for the house and accounts. Organize witnesses. Joseph, the landlord, Mrs. Johnson. Prepare a public statement if Daniel and Sloan escalated their attacks. The more I wrote, the clearer the path became. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building a case that could expose their greed for what it was. When I finished, I closed the notebook and looked at Linda's picture on the wall. They thought I was weak, I whispered, my voice steady and calm. They're about to learn how wrong they were. For the first time since the wedding, I slept through the night. If you're still watching and want to see if there's a way forward after all the chaos, comment number 6 below. Now, let's discover how the first steps toward resolution begin. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, the kind of sterile air that makes you feel both exposed and protected. I walked in slowly, each step measured, Michael by my side. My folder of documents felt heavy in my hands, but heavier still was the knowledge that everything I had endured, humiliation, betrayal, isolation, was leading to this moment. Daniel and Sloan sat on the opposite bench, their faces pale but defiant. She clutched his hand tightly, whispering something sharp that carried across the aisle. Daniel refused to look at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The hearing began with their attorney speaking first. He painted me as an aging man slipping into confusion, claiming my irrational outburst at their wedding was proof I could no longer make sound decisions. He emphasized how destructive it was for me to cut off financial support suddenly, portraying me as unstable. The words stung, but I held my tongue, waiting for my turn. Then came the video, the same one that had circulated online. The attorney hoped it would show me as fragile and erratic. But when the screen lit up with the slap, the gasps in the courtroom told another story. It wasn't my dignity that looked fragile, it was Sloan's cruelty that filled the room. Michael rose with calm precision. He laid out bank statements, receipts, and years of transfers. For over a decade, Mr. Whitaker has provided direct financial support to his son, he explained. These were not gifts from a confused old man. They were deliberate acts of a father propping up a household that could not survive without him. Joseph testified next, his voice steady as stone. He recounted the countless nights he'd heard shouting through my walls, the thinly veiled threats, the real estate appraiser sneaking around my yard. Mrs. Johnson followed, producing the photographs of Sloan with a stranger measuring my property. The room buzzed with whispers. Even the judge leaned forward, brows raised. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. Michael presented dozens of printed pages, comments from the viral video. These are the voices of the community, he said. Thousands of people who saw not a senile man, but a dignified father standing up against abuse. The judge nodded slowly, acknowledging the unusual but powerful evidence. Daniel finally stood, stammering through a half-hearted defense. His words faltered, his voice breaking. We wanted what was best for him, he said. But the room was already against him. Sloan's temper boiled over, and she shouted at the judge about injustice until the gavel cracked sharply. The outburst sealed their fate. The ruling was clear. The petition for guardianship was denied. The judge affirmed my full competency and ordered Daniel and Sloan to cover my legal fees. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was bittersweet. As we left the courthouse, Daniel finally looked at me. His eyes were red, his lips trembling. For a moment, I saw the boy I had raised, the son who used to sit on my shoulders at the fair. But that image shattered as quickly as it came. I met his gaze and said quietly, "I didn't destroy our family, son. You did when you chose greed over love." The cameras outside flashed, reporters shouted questions, but I walked past them all, the sun warming my face. For the first time in months, I felt free, not unscarred, but free. Months slipped by after the courtroom doors closed behind me, each one peeling away another layer of bitterness. Life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known in years. The house stood firm, my accounts were secured, and the gnawing anxiety that had shadowed me since Sloan first entered our family finally began to loosen its grip. I discovered that silence, once heavy with shame, could also hold peace. Neighbors still whispered when they passed me in the market, but now their nods carried respect rather than pity. Some stopped me to say, "You gave me courage," or "I wish my father had done what you did." Their words reminded me that my ordeal had stretched far beyond the walls of my own home. Soon, invitations began arriving. A church group asked me to speak about elder abuse. The local library hosted a seminar where I shared how to safeguard property and dignity. I never thought my pain would be useful to anyone, but each time I spoke, I saw heads nodding, eyes brimming with recognition. My story was not mine alone. It belonged to every senior who had ever been told they were a burden, every parent whose children mistook love for entitlement. One afternoon, I opened a letter written in careful, trembling script. It was from a 72-year-old woman who had watched the viral video of the wedding. She confessed that her son had pressured her to sell her home, promising to take care of everything. After hearing my story, she sought legal counsel and halted the sale. "You saved me," she wrote. "You don't know me, but you gave me the courage to stand." I sat at my kitchen table, tears blurring the words, realizing that my loss had somehow been transformed into another's salvation. Daniel never called. The silence from him was colder than anger, but it was clarity too. I still loved him, the way a father cannot help but love his child, but I no longer lived in the illusion that love required surrender. True love demanded respect, and without it, there could be no family. Evenings often found me on the porch, staring at the garden where Linda and I once shared tea. I would hear her voice in memory, steady and wise. "Dignity is not something you hand away, Thomas. It's something you defend." Only now did I fully grasp what she meant. Looking back, I understood the real lesson. Sacrifice without boundaries feeds greed, not gratitude. The quiet choice to endure can turn into permission for others to exploit. Age does not make us disposable, and silence is not the same as love. One night, with the crickets singing outside and the air cool against my skin, I whispered into the stillness, "I may have lost a son, but I found myself again." And that is a victory no one can steal. If anyone listening to my story takes just one truth from it, let it be this: your worth does not expire with age. Stand firm, set boundaries, protect your dignity. Because sometimes the only way to save the love that matters is to first save yourself. In the end, what remains is not the sting of betrayal or the chaos of conflict, but the undeniable truth that dignity is worth protecting at all costs. Life often tests us in the most unexpected ways, sometimes through the very bonds we once believed unshakable. Yet these trials carry within them a hidden gift, the chance to rediscover strength, to draw boundaries, and to affirm that respect is the foundation of any meaningful relationship. It is easy to confuse silence with peace, but silence in the face of exploitation only deepens the wound. True peace comes from the courage to speak, to stand firm when others expect surrender, and to reclaim the right to live with honor. Every person, regardless of age, deserves to be seen not as a burden or resource, but as a human being with wisdom, value, and an unshakable right to self-determination. This story reminds us that love without respect is hollow, and sacrifice without appreciation is dangerous. To protect oneself is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of survival and, more importantly, an act of love toward the truth. By holding fast to dignity, even when it costs relationships, we safeguard something greater than possessions. We safeguard our very humanity. As seasons change and years pass, one truth remains constant. It is never too late to stand tall. It is never too late to reclaim what was lost, to honor the lessons of pain, and to transform them into wisdom that lights the way for others. In courage, there is renewal. In boundaries, there is freedom. And in the decision to value oneself, there is the beginning of a life lived authentically and without regret. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage, it's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.